Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to our first Grow Lunch and Learn. We're going to be learning about soil today, and just a little introduction to Rural CAP. Rural CAP has been around since the 60s. It's a pretty big nonprofit, and the mission is to empower low-income Alaskans through advocacy, education, affordable housing, and direct services that respect our unique values and cultures. So we have a bunch of different programs, and one of our newer programs is called the GROW program, which stands for Growing Rural Opportunities for Wellness. And basically we just got some money from the CARES Act, and so we are using that to help build the capacity of community gardening projects in 9 rural Alaska communities. And so we're working with them, providing like various levels of technical assistance, or just like purchasing infrastructure, doing different education things to just help build the capacity of projects that people have already gotten started or just getting started. So it's been really fun so far. And now part of our program is having this series of lunch and learns. So we're really happy that you're here, and I'll let Emily take it away.
Cool, thanks, Iva. And I'll also briefly introduce our partner here is the Cooperative Extension Service from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and that's Gina is helping us out. And a lot of, if you're not familiar with Cooperative Extension, it's such a strange word. It's been around for over 100 years. They should have named it like agricultural information, but they didn't. It's called the Cooperative Extension. And what it is it's a bridge between the university and people who are involved in agriculture. UAF also has an ethnobotany program that incorporates indigenous knowledge. It's probably less well known, but we're hoping that that becomes more and more known as well. And we are, our program is, we want to focus on some issues unique to rural gardeners, although a lot of this information could apply to anybody. So we've got 4 speakers here today, and I'm going to briefly introduce them to you. So our first speaker, it says Tia Atkinson, but her indigenous name is Gatgyeda Haayk, and she was born and raised in Metlakatla. She's really passionate about gardening and food sovereignty. She's the coordinator of Metlakatla's community garden. And then we have Valerie Massie. She is the Wrangell Tribe's Indian Environmental General Assistance Program, IGAP for short. And they have had a lot of success incorporating local materials as soil amendments and teaching other people how to make soil in rural places. Then we have Rosanna McInnes from Seldovia. She was a gardener, now she's a farmer. She was able to grow food on her land enough to be able to sell it with a small CSA. She's got raised beds, high tunnel, and is now incorporating hydroponics. And she is a devoted fan of lasagna gardening. And then finally, we have Nick Riordan. He is a lifelong Alaskan. He's a retired geology teacher. He loves food and composting, and he runs Yardutopia, which is a program of the Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and it focuses on growing food in Anchorage and also across the state. And he's really knowledgeable about soil amendments as well. So thank you everybody for joining us. So since we are kind of a large group, we've got 74 people, we will keep our eye on the chat. So if you have questions, pop them in the chat and we will try to address them and do the best we can. So we will start with you, Gatgyeda.
Hello, my name is Gatgyeda Haayk, Tia Atkinson, and I work here in Metlakatla for the Metlakatla Indian community, Sitten Doyet Gum Galts'ap community garden, which in Shmaliak, it translates to community garden. So pretty much when I say it, I'm saying community garden, community garden. And I've been working there for about 5-6 years now. And when I first started, it was pretty barren. All we had in all the beds was peat moss. And I'm just your average home grower adventurer. So I didn't really know. I started planting seeds to grow for our elders, and year after year, like for the first 2 years, I was like, why can't I produce anything? Why isn't nothing growing? And then my boss was like, well, because all you have is peat moss. And I was like, well, I didn't know anything. So I started the composting program here in Metlakatla. And now I'm on the verge of launching a community-wide composting program, because last year was actually my first year of the garden really thriving, because I was able to have that compost soil amendment, and it really, really helped. And it was really amazing to see the garden last year. Just every bed was just thriving and so beautiful and so bountiful. And we were able to grow over 100 pounds of local Indian potatoes, and we gave about half of that to the elders at the community senior center, which was really wonderful. That was a really proud moment of mine, because when we first got those potatoes, it was about 4 years ago, and I only got a handful. And then so now I'm able to give that potato back to the community to grow. And now I have a high school intern that's going to be starting with me this spring, which I'm excited, because that's right when I'm going to be starting my soil amendment, and putting her to work, going out and getting seaweed from the beaches, hauling that to the garden. We've also, anytime that in the community that there's any kind of soil being moved, we make sure to get our hands on at least a good couple of loads of that, so that we could mix that into our compost and into our beds. Because as you know, in Alaska, soil is it's like gold. It's so expensive. And then with our program, we didn't really have many funds. So I had to really go out into the community and really search for anything I could get my hands on to improve the dirt at our garden. And now it's, I still got a lot of work ahead of me, but I'm excited where we're going.
So can you tell us, the transition from peat moss to like a really thriving bed. So what did you end up adding? Like how much seaweed are we talking about?
So about, about every spring, I go out and probably get, I should start weighing it, because I just loaded in. It's probably about 16 totes of seaweed, probably for I think we have about 25 beds at the community garden. But also some of that also does go into our compost pile. And then it also just depends when I could get, usually in the summertime, if I could get my hands on any dirt that's being moved in the community, I'd try and get truckloads and then just work that into my pile. Because as we all know, our dirt is very acidic, not meant for all fruits and vegetables.
So a couple questions. Is it the Haayk potato you're talking about? And then just more information, like what's the ratio, like how big are the garden beds that you're using the totes of seaweed on?
Oh geez, I should know how big the beds are. I did have that.
Or sorry to interject, maybe like how many inches of seaweed do you lay down? Maybe that's.
So I lay about maybe 2 to 3 inches, and I usually put them at the very bottom of the bed. Well, I put down the compost, and then I put down the seaweed, and then I put any of the last year's soil on top of that. And then I'm not too sure how big the beds are. And my boss isn't here to help me out with that.
That's okay. I think that's a good estimate. And I know Valerie works with seaweed too, so we'll hear what she does. Do you also incorporate fish, or do you have leaves? Do you have deciduous trees?
I've got right where the garden is, it is right in the middle of a huge alder patch. So I use that. I have a wood chipper that has come in handy. And then this year we are trying to use fish. We're see how that goes in the springtime, because right now it's still percolating, and we just put down a whole bunch of humpies. We set it in some water for some time, and then we just filled all that on top of that with seaweed. And over all winter it stunk, but finally it doesn't smell so funky. And all I have left are just the skins. So we'll see how that goes.
And Brianna's asking, do you mix in the ingredients, or do you layer?
I've kind of done a little bit of both. And I do. I've ended up mixing them. I have a big, huge metal crate that I use as a big shifter, and just shift and mix it. And then it's kind of like equal parts of compost, old soil, and then seaweed. And I just have like this big, huge tarp laid out with this big crate on a couple of horses, and I just basically grate it and work it till it's really fine.
And how about worrying about animals like bears or other things?
Well, we are pretty fortunate that our animals are pretty scarce. Our community garden is pretty close to town. It's not in town, but it's like right there on the outskirts. So we don't really have any problems other than like dogs and cats, but we have a barricade for that.
Okay. I'm sure we'll hear more from you. We're going to go on to Valerie, and then I'm guessing that there will be questions where you can add in some of your observations as well. So Valerie, go ahead.
Thank you. And Gatgyeda, did I say it right?
Gatgyeda.
Gatgyeda. It sounds like we're living very similar composting lives. Like pretty much everything you're talking about, we're also working on. So it's really encouraging to hear. I'll probably be asking you questions after this. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Valerie. I am the IGAP coordinator here in Wrangell, and I learned everything that I'm about to share from my coworker Kim, and she grew up in Wrangell, and she's a Alaska master gardener, and she's very talented and knowledgeable. And I wish she could have been here today, but she's out this week for some unfortunate reason. So she's a wealth of knowledge. If you have other questions about this, you can ask her or I. So I don't know if it's possible to share my screen, Emily.
I think you can, because you should be a co-host. There's the green button at the bottom.
Oh, I see it. Okay. So I'll do that. And I just looked this article up just recently from you guys at the Cooperative Extension. And what I know from Kim is that we have very acidic soil here. And I was like, why do we have that? And so just from this highlighted portion, you guys all see that okay? So
Yes.
it looks like, I bet most people know this already, but I didn't know because I'm a beginning gardener myself. Is why it's acidic. And a lot of that comes from just the amount of rain that we get here and the recent geological timeline of soil creation that we're operating with here, and all sorts of different aspects that create acidic soil. And so to counteract that, what Kim showed me and what we made a video about, we held an in-person class last spring, was this lasagna gardening method. And so this is just a little illustration that we shared with folks through a gardening pamphlet that we printed out. And so ours are just, this is at our community garden. We just have four-sided wooden beds that were just flat on the ground. And the ground just has some wood chips on it. It doesn't drain very well. It's in a very marshy area on the edge of town, similar to what it sounds like where it is in Metlakatla. And so to help with all the rain that we get, we just put a layer of probably 6 inches or so of 6 inches to a foot of gravel down here, and then went in with dirt, just local dirt, and then trying to counteract that acidity with some carbon from bladderwrack or rockweed or whatever you want to call it, popweed. But we also gathered that, and then we have a single mill here still, so we bought some wood shavings from them. So layering that kind of twice, and then at the top layer mixing in some of our finished compost so that we could put that in the fall ideally, and then throughout the winter everything has a chance to break down, and by the growing season you have some really fertile, suitable soil. And we tried this in a couple garden beds last April that were not going to be planted, and we checked them at the end of the summer, and you couldn't even see the striations anymore. It was just all one color of soil, which was cool to see that it actually worked. And then my own personal garden, I also tried fish heads, and I just kind of chucked all of my compost in there, which was my own version of trench composting, which is where instead of having to compost either through a cold or a hot system and then incorporating it into the garden, you just put the food waste straight into the dirt and you cover that up, and then you kind of alternate the spaces so that, you know, one season you're just growing in this area, and then the next season after you've got the composted spot, you can start planting in there, and then you just keep going down, you know, down the line, just like I've illustrated in this little bottom portion. So we tried a few different methods, and thanks to the Grow program, we'll be able to plant and actually see the fruits of our labor this growing season is the plan. But right now we're at a good place where we've got a lot of amended soil to work with.
Awesome. I'm gonna actually, this is a good photo for this one because I forgot Iva's question earlier, which is and that this is could be open to any of you. Are there any concerns with over harvesting seaweed from the beaches?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And we have last year we have our own department gardening projects and composting, and then because of the COVID money that our tribe got, we also helped do a larger scale of gardening and seaweed harvesting. So there was concern about making sure that we didn't over harvest, because we tried to go out and get dead seaweed that had already washed up, and it's what are those called? It's not the roots, but there's a when they're attached to the rock, like free seaweed that was clearly dying and it was pretty high out of the intertidal zone. But also go around to different beaches so that there was never a completely barren beach somewhere. And they harvested quite a bit. We hired a few local laborers to harvest the seaweed and build garden beds and distribute those garden beds. And so they filled up 4 fish totes that we got to borrow from the local fish processing plant. And those were each about 3 by 3 feet on the inside. So I don't know exactly what that volume is, but they filled them up, and then over time the seaweed compressed and broke down and they could fit more in there. So I don't know the total amount, but we made sure to direct them to go to different beaches so that there wasn't an over harvest anywhere. Because it is so important just for those natural environments where they count on little microorganisms count on seaweed breaking down.
Another question, again, really for any of you, if you're going to use fish like salmon leftovers or freeze dried, I mean freezer burned fish, what layer would you put it in order, for best efficacy, less smells, fewer animals?
Yeah, I'm curious myself because I've only looked up the guidelines of at least a foot deep, but I'm very inexperienced. So anyone else that knows, I would love to hear too.
This is Rosanna. I don't know if you can all hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I use fish regularly, and always as the bottom layer, I do put cardboard down first, but we'll see pictures here in a minute.
Awesome. And this is a question I wondered too. Do you rinse the salt off the seaweed? Do you need to do that before you add it to your compost?
We didn't. So far, I haven't heard of any issue with the salt being on there, but there's always more to learn. So.
And does the kind of seaweed matter? Again, anybody can answer that one, I guess.
I don't think it really matters. We just take the seaweed that on the shoreline that's already dead and processing.
I've actually heard a little bit about that. People traditionally used to plant like in the high tide line, like maybe you'd go off to fish camp and you'd plant potatoes in the high tide line and then go off and do other stuff and then come back at the end of the summer. Is that, I don't know, is that true?
I haven't heard anything, but I know that we also used rockweed just because it was so plentiful already. It wasn't time.
Kelp and alder leaves is a wonderful combination.
What was the second one?
Alder leaf.
Oh, alder. Oh, yeah.
And then I realized I did miss another question. How deep are your raised beds? And maybe both speakers that have gone already can answer that.
Yeah, ours were typically we had some scrap wood that we were able to use, so the board height changed a little bit, but usually it was about 1 to 2 feet. So this drawing is just exaggerated to show the layers.
Great, thank you. I think we're ready for Rosanna. Oh, thank you, and a foot or two deep, thank you. So Valerie, yeah, there you go.
Emily, you're on mute.
Rosanna, are you able to share your screen? Or do you want me to do it?
Maybe Nick could go next. It seems like she might be having some, oh, there she is. Okay.
And Rosanna, I can share if you want to just talk, if that would help. Okay, let me do that. Whoops.
You're on mute, Rosanna.
All right, can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, that took me a sec.
Okay.
All right.
So one of my primary goals and one of the reasons I love lasagna gardening is that I want to teach people that they can create soil and they can grow really healthy, abundant, wonderful food by gathering resources that they have in their own backyards, in their own area. And I think that sometimes we get too burdened down by the minutia. We have to do our compost with these perfect percentages, and we have to have exactly this many of that and this many of that. And my take on this whole thing and why I do lasagna is that it doesn't need to be so scientific. It can be a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you're still going to have success. I want people to be not afraid of it. And so I'm going to talk to you about what our normal recipe is that I use, but I'm also going to say you don't have to know everything to make this work for you. So this first picture here is a side view of carrots growing in a lasagna bed that 6 months old. I think that I made this lasagna bed in the fall and then grew the carrots the next spring. And you can see, we're going to look at the layers here in a second, but you can see that there's no sign of layering. It has all composted, self-composted in place and turned into this soil that these carrots could grow in. You can go to the next screen, Emily. Boy, I don't know if we could make that bigger. That's probably really hard for people to read. This is the list of some of the ideas of what you could use. And I'm sure that there are more out there, and I would welcome for anybody to add to it. But I'm going to make it bigger here. Cardboard, newspaper, straw. And when I say straw, that could also include beach grasses that might grow in your area, or even wild grasses that grow and are dried out, wood chips or sawdust, animal manure, household compost can be used in these lasagna beds, old plant waste, maybe you're breaking down your garden at the end of the fall, that can go in it. Fresh grass clippings is a great source of nitrogen. It really gets your pile heated up and going fast. Fish scraps, I love. There are so many nutrients in fish scraps, and I love this resource because so many of us have access to it. Seaweed for the micronutrients. Dried leaves, I love these. Of course, they're a good source of carbon, and they do have nutrients, but the reason I love them most of all is because of what you see in the picture there. I'll crawl underneath the trees in my yard, and I have a mixture of cottonwood and willow and alder. And I'll just basically crawl on my hands and knees and gather up armfuls of dead leaves, put them into the buckets and carry them to my lasagna bed. But I just love that what I'm also doing at the same time is, you can imagine these are sitting on the floor of the forest. And so I'm at the same time gathering the mycelium, or the mushroom spores, which is really good as well. And I want that in my lasagna beds. I want to have that activity to start breaking everything down and make great homes for the little organisms. So when I see mushrooms in my compost in my gardens, I get really happy because it tells me there's action going on. And that's what I like about the leaves. Also the peat moss, wood ash can give you calcium and can lower that acidity. So for a lot of us who have problem with acid soil, If you don't have access to lime, or maybe you can't afford lime, take the wood ash out of your wood stove and use that in place of it. Mushrooms, and I put as an example freezer burned food, really, but a lot of us, we have berries, and a lot of us may have freezer burnt old berries that aren't being used. That's just an example of a resource that you might have that you didn't think about. So anyway, the list goes on and is bigger than this, but this is just to give you some ideas that you already have most of these things to build your soil for your beds, and you can do it. You can grow in these right away. So we'll go to the next slide, Himalayan. So in my garden, I'm going to give you now our most common recipe, which is I start with cardboard, and I lay that cardboard directly down onto whatever surface I have. Most of the time it's on vegetation that's already growing. I don't turn it, I don't dig it first, I don't prepare the bed. I literally go right on top of the vegetation that's already there with my cardboard. That's my first layer. My next layer is fish carcasses. And in my community, it's a small fishing town. We have our first run of fish in May, but we also have people who are cleaning out their freezers in the spring, and they've got that freezer burnt fish. And if I wanted, I could go down to the harbor anytime where people are cleaning the fish that they've caught, and instead of putting it into the waste bin where they're going to tug this big, huge vat of fish out into the ocean and just dump it, I say fill up my buckets and I have it really easily. And I'm not picky about the fish, just so you know, it's the same thing. I'm happy about what the fish does for my the whole activity. Basically, it kickstarts, it gives that punch and starts heating everything up and breaking things down. So I'll take halibut, I'll take whatever they have, any kind of fish. And I do keep chickens on my property. And for me, that's my next layer, which is basically in my chicken coop. I do a system where I don't clean the coop out. Basically, you just keep adding fresh layer of bedding, layer after layer after layer. It helps to keep the chicken coop warmer in the winter. So it does serve that purpose. But what else it does is that by the time I get to the spring, I can dig down into the bottom layer of the chicken coop, and that chicken manure has composted already. It has broken down. And so I'll dig that stuff out and use that as a layer. You could use multiple kinds of animal manures if you don't have chickens, rabbit, horse. Some of you might have access to cow, but maybe not. Probably most of us who aren't on the road system don't have that. But I was thinking even moose droppings would be kind of cool in there. I think that's something to consider, since we can gather those kind of easily. And then my next layer is either leaves or straw. It's a carbon layer. The fish and the chicken manure are heavy on the nitrogen side, so I'll put another carbon layer in there. But again, I used to use mostly straw, but for me in Seldovia, it's hard to get straw over here. So I like the leaves, and actually now I use them more because of telling you about the mycelium and getting the spores and the fungi in there, and that's what the leaves do. And then I see that I forgot a bullet point in here in between lawn. I didn't. The next one is lawn clippings or green grass. And you can also, if you don't have lawn clippings, you could go to the beach and literally break off green beach grass. You could use household compost instead of lawn clippings. So there's a couple of options for that layer. But that layer, again, helps heat and helps kick things off for making everything break down. So green grass is a really great nitrogen for that top layer. And then I'll gather up only about an inch, not very much, only about an inch of native soil, whether it's from underneath the alder trees or from that area right there where I'm growing. It doesn't take much, and you're going to see in the pictures. And I do use seaweed as well here. I would like to use it more. And I think somebody asked the question about salt and rinsing it. And basically what I do is I leave the seaweed in a pile before I do anything with it. And Seldovia is part of the rainforest. So like many of you, we do get a lot of rain. I'll just basically let it sit there and get rained on for a little while, and then add it as a mulch in the fall. But you could add it as a layer, just like Valerie did, no problem. You can put it in there. It's like cooking. So if you're making your, yes, Amanda, yes, I would say so. It's a, I like the seaweed because it's got all those fantastic micronutrients, but my point is that we don't have to be perfect with this. Use what we have and you're still going to get something. What you're doing is putting nutrients into a pile and it's going to break down, and maybe you're cooking it a little bit differently than I'm cooking it, but you're still cooking it and you're going to get something. Because I just don't want people worrying and thinking that this is not attainable, that they can't do it. Yeah, you can do it. Just use what you got. Just pretend you're in the kitchen cooking up a meal for somebody, and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I don't know the answer to that dog waste question. I would not do that, but maybe there's people, yeah, that would. Yeah. Okay, so can you go to the next slide, Emily? So there's two pictures here, Emily, and I'll have you toggle between them. This is a picture, and basically I'm building these beds as I grow. And so in this instance, I didn't have very much fish, but you can see I just unfold the cardboard. I don't even rip it up into small pieces. That's a wooden frame that I'm starting with just to hold things in, but we don't have to hold things in. I'm laying it flat, and then I'm putting my fish pieces on it. And by the way, these are my beds are about 10 inches by the time I'm done. And if you go to the next screen, Emily, this was a case where I had tons of fish, and I would actually tell you this is probably too much fish. In this case, I actually did pull some off, but it was one of the only other pictures I had of that first layer. And in this case, I didn't even use a wooden frame to hold it in. I've got my cardboard and I've got my fish. And I want you to all know that I live in an area which is super thick with black bears. I watch them go by my house all the time. They're always in the neighborhood. I have been doing this with fish for a very long time. And if you do it correctly, which is to cover it up completely and get all the layers in, what's going to happen is it's going to start breaking down right away. And I have never one time, and I should knock on wood, but I haven't ever had a problem with bears getting into it. And that's because it starts to break down almost immediately, and that fish smell goes away within basically by the time you're done building it. So that's my answer on fish, but I'm not going to tell anybody. You just have to be wise about your area. What I will say is maybe some of you could be less afraid of using fish than you have been. Just keeping in mind, you want to keep it all the way covered up, keep it all the way covered, nothing poking out, no pieces exposed. Okay, next slide. Again, there's my layer of the chicken manure. I told you how, no, Trisha, I have black bears, no grizzlies. So maybe that's different when you live near grizzlies. So just carefully consider. I did have a master gardener. After he came to my garden, he looked at it and he decided to try using fish, and he had never used it before because he was afraid of the grizzlies. But he decided to try, and now that's what he does. He was in Homer, and anyway, he was like, well, Rosanna can do it, I'm going to try. So anyway, the chicken manure layer there, I'm just digging to the bottom of my coop and getting out that stuff that's broken down. So that's that layer. We could go to the next slide. And these are my two examples, the next layer being a carbon layer. These on the left is the leaves that I just get on my hands and knees and scoop up. And on the right is what it looks like if I use straw or dried grass. And you can see by now it's looking pretty fluffy. So it's actually higher than my 10 inches. Well, I mean, it's just cottony like a sponge. Next slide, please. And then this is the second to last layer that I would do, which is, and we'll go back one, either grass clippings or household compost. And that's got eggshells in it and everything, that household compost. And that's only gonna have about an inch of topsoil on it. And I'm gonna plant right into that. It's not even broken down yet. It's gonna start breaking down pretty quickly, but I'm just telling you guys too, the other thing is you don't have to wait to plant into these. At least I don't. I plant into them as soon as I build them, and they compost in place. They build heat in place while they're composting. So the baby roots love it, love the warmth. And we've got the mycelium from the leaves, we've got the fish breaking down, we've got the action going on. You can go right into it. The next slide here just shows, you could go to the next one, Emily, please. Backwards one. Okay, and so you can see this is what it would look like in my beds that I build that are long. You can see it's just a really small layer of the topsoil on top of the green grass. And then I put my plants right in it. That's what that is on the right. As soon as I build that bed, all the plants start to go into the beds on the same day. And Charlotte's asking, do I fertilize? No, because this is basically a working compost pile that you've created here. And you can, I mean, sometimes we make like a nettle leaf watering compost tea or something like that, but no, you don't have to. So at least we don't, but you can. Yeah, it's feeding the plants already because this is compost in place. It's breaking down and it's providing all these different nutrients. It's breaking.
Oh, Rosanna, we lost you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Rosanna.
Oh, that might be
Sorry.
me.
Yeah, I think it was you.
I think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think my headphones battery died, so I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot. Oh good, I'm glad you can hear me better. I took them totally off. So Carol's asking, is it necessary to do every year? No, it's how I have built my beds in the garden. And once I build these beds, then they're established. And what we do is we just add compost on the top layer. So this is a way to take your garden from, I don't know where I'm going to get soil. I live in the interior, or I live in the southeast, and it costs, you know, $1 a pound to bring in soil. You don't have to do it. You have what you need to build your beds. You can plant right into this stuff right away. At least I do. And then if you go to the next slide, Emily. So this is just pictures. So on the left is Napa cabbage into a freshly made lasagna bed. And on the right is an onion. I have them in starts. I started my own onions, so you can see a little bit of perlite there. But both of those are planted directly into freshly made lasagna beds and growing right away. And I just have, I think, 1 or 2 more slides, Emily. So on the left is my garden manager, and she's holding those Napa cabbages that we grew right away into our lasagna beds, and they were beautiful. And Becca, I see your question. I grow my own starts, and so I always use starts, but you could direct seed into this too. In fact, I did arugula directly seeded into it. Last year, my earliest lasagna bed that I made in April, and it was when I measured the heat of that bed, it was measuring 10 degrees warmer than any of the other beds that I had. And we had arugula as a first crop, and those were just directly seeded. On the right is a picture of rows of Salanova lettuce growing in a freshly made lasagna bed as well. And then I think I have one more picture. This was our very first CSA share, and everything in this picture was grown either in a freshly made lasagna bed or one that was made the previous year. And so I just wanted you to see that plants love this method. And yeah, I wonder if anybody has any questions. Some of the beds are in a high tunnel, Krista, and some are outside.
I think there were a lot of questions I probably missed. So I apologize. But how about we hear from Nick, and then I think I bet a lot of these questions we will get to. So, and don't worry, we will get to everything. Sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
Thanks, Emily. And yeah, thanks, Rosanna, and other speakers. This has been great information. It's nice to follow on top of this. I thought a few interesting things to add. One of the dilemmas we have in Alaska, why we'd even be looking to build soil, is the southern part of our state, like south of the Alaska Range, was glaciated pretty recently, and north of the Brooks Range was glaciated pretty recently. The interior, not so much. You may have heard of the Bering Land Bridge. So there was no ocean to the west. There was no source of moisture to generate snow, to create ice, to create glaciers to the interior. So it was, I think, in many ways saved. So depending where you are in the state, you may be very soil poor or soil rich. So it does vary a bit depending on which side of the mountains you're on. I think another aspect that's come to mind while listening to these other guests is that a lot of what we're talking about is adding organic matter. When we talk about soils, you can say dirt, and we're just talking about the mineral components, the clays, the little bits of sand, whatever minerals those may be, often quartz or feldspars or whatnot. But the mineral components, broken down rocks, basically, or the organic components. And these plants really do like having organic matter in the soil, not just the plants, but the other organisms. And so that's much of what I think we've been hearing about today is how to introduce that organic matter. And it comes with a lot of nutrients and trace minerals and all the things that keeps the microorganisms happy, keeps the plants happy, and keeps us happy too. We're all part of that food chain. So I think so. Then a question could be, if you do have, is what organic material is available to you? And I think we've heard of this, awesome lists of different things you can use. And I love the point about, it's a recipe kind of like cooking. We can use we use what we have. I have neighbors who put salmon into their, they grow in pots and literally in 5-gallon buckets. Every year they dump those in the fall, they dump those 5-gallon buckets out. They bury fish in the pile of dirt. And then in the spring again, they take that pile of dirt, put it back in their 5-gallon buckets, and they grow in it again. Other folks have a lot of, in Anchorage, where I'm based, you have a lot of leaves because people want their lawns to be cleaned. So a lot of grass clippings, a lot of leaves through these lawn maintenance companies. But if people have chicken manure or horse manure or something, they mix that with the leaves. They get or just leave the leaves, but get a nice leaf mold or something. But it's, again, it really depends where you're at and what organic matter you have available to you. And so it's a great first question, I think, an early question is, what organic matter do I actually have? And there's always, I think, whatever your answer is to that question, there's probably like a way to do it. And somebody, I bet, in Alaska who's doing it. And so then it's just like, who do I need to call? And there's awesome people on this call and elsewhere in the state who can connect you, I think, with those folks. What was I going to say?
I will jump in and say, if you live in a part of Alaska without leaves, you can use newspaper, shredded newspaper, which really used to be trees. And so you can use your shredded newspaper in place of leaves, and that's your high carbon one. And almost everybody lives in Alaska where there's a lot of coffee grounds. And those are all things that you can save throughout the winter to get ready. So there's tons of questions in the chat, and one that's come up a bunch of times, and maybe each of you could address this, but so you've built a lasagna bed, and then what do you do each year to amend it?
Oh, do you want me to field that one, or is anyone welcome to?
I will say maybe each of you could speak briefly.
Yeah, sometimes I find those lasagna beds, every 3 years is a kind of a time frame to rebuild them. One of the primary motivators there is actually suppressing weeds. Again, in my circumstance, you're often growing in lawns or grass, you have clack grass or something that infiltrates and becomes a nuisance. And so people will start off with that cardboard layer again and rebuild it just to kill the other plants that have joined the party.
I mulch in place, so my last crop of the season, I'll just mulch it right there in place and leave the roots and everything in. I'll put the seaweed on in the fall, and then we still have a big learning curve and a lot of work to do on a compost program at my place. But ideally, then we start over in the spring with a layer of compost on top of everything.
Okay, Southeast gardeners, how about slugs? What do you do about slugs? And I'm not sure what you mean by root rot, Laura. Maybe if you're thinking of root maggots.
I pick, and I for a while was putting out salt and killing them, but I just felt really bad myself. So, and it is tedious. You have to pick and pick, and especially during the spring when those eggs burst and they're so small you could barely see them. I've yet to find a perfect solution for that myself. So hopefully somebody might have a solution on here.
I haven't tried it myself, but I've heard, having ducks around or having copper around the edge of the bed helps a lot, but I have yet to.
I wanted to mention that when we put the wood ash in our flower beds and garden beds, it almost totally eliminated our slugs naturally.
I know a lot of people add wood ash as an amendment. I've heard it does sort of, it will stop your composting pile. I don't know, maybe one of you know about this. It'll stop your heating immediately, but I don't know about that. I haven't tried.
I would think something that's going to change the pH. Composting is a biological process, and so you really need water. You don't want it to dry out, and probably dramatically, changing the pH with adding wood ash would certainly change which organisms are going to be able to live there.
My favorite time to use wood ash is in the spring. And that is directly on top of the snow where the beds are, because the wood ash is dark and absorbs the sunlight. And you'll find when you do that, so it gets dissipated a little bit as the snow is melting. But it also serves another function, which is to melt the snow off of those beds, and sometimes 1 or 2 weeks earlier than your other beds.
Nick, is there a good online source for learning more about Alaska's natural soil types and soil formation history?
Ooh, I don't have one off the top of my head. There is an Alaska Geological Society. It's going to be full of awesome resources. There are maps that exist. The USGS has resources, certainly, and a website, and in Alaska, some local professionals. So these would be good first points of contact.
And I'm looking back through the chat here. If I've missed your question, you might want to restate it, and I apologize for that. But I'm looking here at one. Krista asked, is there a way to clean dirt of aphids, eggs, etc.? Maybe comment on pests in general.
I'm going to say diversity and lots of homes for bugs. I always plant flowers, multiple types of flowers. Of marigolds is a long-standing Alaska tradition, but all kinds of flowers in and throughout my garden so that the bugs have lots of happy places.
I think there were a couple of questions about just in the winter, like how can you compost throughout the winter? What can you do in the winter? And then can you use lasagna beds to overwinter crops because it heats the soil?
If I may jump in there, in terms of winter composting, which I put in quotes, a tip that I've seen be successful and done myself is just taking my own food waste through the winter, and I put it either in a big garbage can or in a pile, which my dog always loves, but then I layer it through the winter with leaves or some sort of carbon source so that when it thaws out, it's already in place, it's already mixed with the appropriate other ingredients. And that requires a little bit of planning to have those, in my case, leaves or newspaper or cardboard, whatever, on hand. But it just saves me a headache in the spring that might involve just an icky, smelly mess. Spring's a busy time of year, so it's in the wintertime, it's a little easier to manage.
Vermicomposting is nice too in the winter with worms. I've had a worm bin, and our house is pretty small, so I've only tried it in the summer, but I know other people that I know who vermicompost, keep them indoors so that they don't get too hot and dry out or get cold and freeze.
Thanks, Valerie. That's actually a great segue into one of our later discussions. Let's see, on February 15th, our Lunch and Learn is about composting in Alaska and composting. And one of our speakers is going to be Amanda, who's here today, who's going to talk about keeping worms in the winter. And I was just going to say, I do what Nick does. I keep 5-gallon buckets outside my door and I toss in things, but I'm lazier than he is, so I don't have any leaves or anything. And it is in the spring, it's like mushy, but all you have to do is add leaves or, your newspaper, whatever kind of high carbon source you have around, and it's ready to go.
The freeze thaw cycle, Emily, I think really does wonders for speeding up this process. You always want high surface area with whatever you're dealing with. So
I'm seeing another question here. Are grass clippings that were raised with weed killing fertilizer, should they be used?
There are studies about weed and feed is a particularly problematic thing in here in Anchorage because it's a fertilizer and then broadleaf herbicide combined. And so if you get a broadleaf herbicide in your vegetable garden, it will kill anything that's not a grass. So it kills the plants you're trying to grow. So that's, I think, one of the roots of the concern. Obviously, you don't want to consume it either, but just at the first stage of affairs, it really gets in the way of what you've put all this effort into doing. Hot composting, there are scientific papers out there on this topic about how much of these herbicides last through a phase of hot composting. And it does greatly reduce the quantity of herbicide. This stuff does get washed away. But it's something that I personally tried. I use very little green grass these days because I'm in Anchorage and the prevalence of it. But if you have your own lawn, you know your neighbor, you're not using herbicides on the lawn, it's not an issue.
Are there other questions that I've missed? I know we're still kind of a large group, but please unmute yourself if you have. I'm going to put, because I know it's 1 o'clock, I'm going to put in the chat here a link to an evaluation form. This was our first one. So if you have any feedback for us, like, what worked or what didn't work, I'd really appreciate it. But we are going to have a whole series. And if you registered for this one, you'll automatically get the emails for the next ones. And I will also put here, if you are on Facebook, we have our little Grow program Facebook page, and we just put resources in there. And of course, our thank you, Metlakatla, for letting us being our cover model for our Facebook page. So any final questions? And I'm happy to stick around and help anyone. Yes, Amanda, if Valerie, if you don't mind, I have the photos of that lasagna one, and I can email that to you. I can ask Gina, actually, is the chat included in the recording? Ooh, I don't know that one.
The chat records as part of the recording, yes.
Okay, awesome. Valerie, is it okay if
If I could jump in there, my understanding is the chat does not record unless you download it to your, you have to save it and download it. At the bottom of your chat screen should be 3 dots where if you click on it, it will say save chat.
Mm-hmm.
So then it will download as a document to your desktop. Otherwise, it does not record as part of the recording.
It does. You can watch it live. The chat will come up real time with the recording. But yes, you can also download it by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking the ellipse and save chat option.
Okay, you'll have to tell me how that happens because I've never been able to see that in live time, but we'll talk later. Thanks. Thanks, Gina.
So thank you so much to our presenters. I really appreciate your time and energy and everything you do. It's really, really generous of you. So thank you so much. And thanks everybody for coming, and hopefully we will see you in 2 weeks at the next Lunch and Learn.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, everyone. Thanks for organizing. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Awesome.
Thank you. I'll talk to you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.
So Gina, should I hit the record button?
Yes, please.
Okay, there we go. Stop cloud recording.